SOMA is an interesting game. It's hard to describe it properly because if you just retell its story, you're doing a disservice to the themes, and if you just tell someone what the themes are, you do a disservice to incredible moments of storytelling. If you haven't played the game, this video will not make sense. I am not making this video for people who haven't played SOMA, so there's going to be a lot of spoilers. But the way that I have come to describe SOMA is that it is like you're listening to a funeral dirge, and then some random philosophy nerd shows up and starts blasting you questions about the meaning of life and humanity, and the combined effect of the dirge and his questions leaves you blurry-eyed and weak, and then some asshole blasts loud synth music at you until you get back to the dirge. SOMA has something known as safe mode, a feature for cowards, like me. It does not help cowards, like me. The monsters still rage and chase and hunt for you, they simply don't hurt you. They back away or stay close, but don't swipe and slash at you. This removes stress from the game, an immense ludic change even if the story is untouched. What removes stress, but not fear, on first blush, sounds like an interesting riddle you're asked shortly before a sphinx consumes your liver. However, I think it's an important distinction to make for what I'm talking about. Fear is an inherently different emotion that is often paired with stress in the real world, but in the context of entertainment, the two aren't nearly as linked as people might think they are. For example, you can be scared and tense during a movie, but you don't get so tense, wound up, and angry that you rage quit the movie, go up to the projector, and punch the guy manning it. You can absolutely stop watching a movie because you think it's too scary, too gross, or too bad. But what separates merely being emotional about a piece of media and what makes you stressed over a piece of media, at least to me, is the presence of a fail state. In other words, you feel stress when you have stakes involved, a dog in the race, a third metaphor for personal involvement. Personal involvement is an extremely effective way to get someone invested in something, and having that sword of Damocles, otherwise known as an hour between your last save and the monster you're now encountering, hanging over you and your experience produces a different sort of reaction. There is frustration, fear, and anxiety, but there's also the ever-present feeling of shame whenever you are not good enough to do something, and those all come together to produce the specific feeling I am describing as stress. Fear was once divided by noted salami writer Stephen King into three base parts. A gross out, self-explanatory, horror, which is when something directly happens to a character that is fear-inducing, and terror, which is when something is wrong but the exact causes aren't known. These can all exist independent of stress, and inducing stress through failure is a hallmark of games. Safe mode in SOMA removes this entirely, and so it enters a bit of a gray zone. You're still interacting with the world, hiding from things, and I still think it qualifies as a game, but it's a fundamentally different experience, slower paced even as monsters plod beside you. You can take in the world, you can take your time, and you can even bait monsters to see them in better detail with no fear of losing. So how does this impact change the actual game? Well, I already spoiled this section, mostly the fact you don't die. The story itself doesn't change at all, and this is for the better and the worse. For the better because some AI interactions are really interesting when they aren't trying to murder you. And for the worse, because a lot of the flaws of SOMA come out to play. An undeniable negative feature of this mode is that it shows just how samey the enemies feel. This is a problem in SOMA normal, sure. They're all blind, they're all responsive to sound, you just yeet something and hope it works. But when you're cowering in terror, hoping you're not caught and killed, thinking, wow, this is like the last enemy, isn't high on your list of priorities. Without this threat, they feel almost like reskins of each other. In addition, because the story changes so little, the plot itself has some weaknesses that are shown. For example, Simon looks like a way bigger idiot for for not understanding he's basically a file and not a personality, and so the climactic argument at the end of the game feels... Well, I understand why Catherine is a little bit more exasperated than I thought reasonable before. I still don't like her. She's a character who hits a lot of my "oh, you're the prick" buttons, and that's not a bad thing. She's a great foil for Simon in the game, a know-it-all and a lost time traveler, when the know-it-all doesn't understand others don't know it all. And I am absolutely willing to interpret this as Simon being too traumatized by, well, this. In order to process what's actually being said. Simon, as a character, is a person marked by fear, trauma, and confusion, so it's an absolute possibility. It is, of course, utterly unreasonable for us to expect the creators to change things in the story for what amounts to a difficulty level, so being charitable is for the better. By allowing you to look at enemies without fear of death and letting you wander around them far more safely, it's still not letting you feel total and complete emancipation from fear. It is a horrifying game. The sound effects and visuals alone make it an effective piece of horror, and the fear of dying doesn't do much to change that once removed. Some of the biggest AI changes I noticed were interesting though. There's this moment I want to talk about later, involving one of the monsters, where they would chase and respond to me. In safe mode, I tried the good old-fashioned fractional method of removing spoops. That is, throwing an object near them but away from me. Didn't move. Stood there, forcing me to creep past it and grab stuff from behind it. No response. Snuck past it, no response. Grabbed stuff from behind it, no response. It was strange and made me feel weird. And you of course still do have incentives to avoid the monsters. They're loud, they cause weird visual effects, and they are threatening in the same way a really well constructed horror movie monster is. So, that's how SOMA changes the game in a very literal way when you turn safe mode on. This is the most subjective part of the video, so forgive me if your experience differs. Or don't, I'm not a cop. Stress is something that stops me from thinking too deeply. Most of the time, I'm developing these scripts after I play a game, when I'm done, and I'll rewatch footage. However, when I'm playing SOMA's safe mode, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. It really makes the game feel not better, but different in a lot of key ways. That experience I talked about earlier, the monster who just sat there and did nothing, stuck with me in a way the experience didn't beforehand. It drove home just how cruel the situation is, how everyone involved doesn't want to be part of this damn experiment by this damn AI. Made me feel sad. The monsters I was facing were human beings, people like me with little to no connection to reality, almost no will of their own, just horrible, horrible things happening to good, or at least flawed, but ultimately human people. I was also able to pay way more attention to dialogue and spend less time fiddling around, and while that does reveal some of the things I considered flaws, such as the aforementioned repetitiveness of the monsters and the extreme repetitiveness of the moral choices, seriously, how many times can they throw "you kill this dysmorphic robot that doesn't think it's a robot in order to progress" at you as a moral quandary? But it also helped me understand the characters better. I started to get really annoyed with Catherine and her "and thou must" pleading with Simon. I had to experience the existentially horrifying things while she basically got to sleep. How she seemed to care less about suicides in front of her and more about the ARC project. It gave me a new perspective on her. Where before, I could be sure that speaking to her meant I was absolutely safe. She's the exposition vehicle, so there's no monsters around her because we wouldn't want the player to miss any exposition. But now I was seeing her in a somewhat different light, not as a safety beacon, but as a character whom I was interacting with. the entire experience itself changed. I could go on and on about every emotional beat and what that felt like, but all of that is only possible because of the fundamental experience of Soma in safe mode is not that of a horror game, but more like a horror movie. Not quite, because it's still my actions and I'm still controlling my character, but the distinct feeling of stress and being worried I'll die and need to restart is gone. The game distinctly felt like Soma, but not being worried about what I was doing if I could mess up made it feel different. It hit different for reasons I can't fully explain. But that final shot, that final hopeful shot of Earth ruined as the Ark floats away into space around the orbit of the sun, left me tight-chested, empty and hollow, just like it was in the first time I ever played. The brilliance of Soma is that it can make such a shot, so universally understood as hopeful, the pan across space into an empty, desolate moment, regardless of what the monsters do. That's an experience I don't get much of. Being able to soak in the world, listening to the ambiance, having the freedom to look through the details of the area, I came to appreciate how a lot of the areas with monsters are designed as these spaces that are wide and large but made of dozens of tunnels so they still feel constrained. You can slink and hide around like a mouse. I really took in the aesthetic of a game I hadn't before. The hospital overgrown with cancer aesthetic of Pathos 2 made me appreciate the game in a whole new way. Soma's safe mode is an extremely interesting experiment in game design. How is a horror game affected by losing its main threat? I don't think Soma is negatively impacted by it all too much. In a game less concerned with questions of morality and humanity and forcing you to confront those questions, safe mode would be straight up boring. Soma is a strong game, and it's a strong game not because of or in spite of its safe mode, but because it simply is one. It is meticulously built with careful design to layout, setting, and sound. Its story has a lot of beats that really only work in a video game context, forcing the player to make choices that allow them to progress. Whereas in a movie, we might see a person who pulls the plug on a dying person to get a train started as less than good. When we're in that person's situation directly, that influences us to try and rationalize what's going on. Games often do need a fail state. God moding feels boring, wrong even. You're losing out on the challenge and the fun of the game, but something like Soma doesn't really need a fail state. It becomes more like an interactive movie with you sitting back and being relaxed, or as relaxed as someone can be when there's a monster around, without feeling like you've failed at any point. I think this sort of experience is really good. I would like to see more of it. More games that eschew the typical sort of Damocles over the player and instead let you experience it more fully on the basis of design, sound, and plot. Will it work? Not all the time. Maybe not even most of the time. It's a gamble, an experiment, something that might cause the company itself to fail if it doesn't pan out. So having it as an option in an otherwise more typical game experience makes sense. But I'd like to see more of it. That's it. That's the thesis statement. It's cool. Nothing groundbreaking, I guess. Thanks for watching. And thank you to my patrons who support this channel. I'm currently in the middle of university, which is not a great time to also be writing my own fiction and working on a YouTube channel. And the people who support me either by subscribing or by donating to my Patreon or even just liking or commenting mean the world to me. Thank you.